Welcome to Therapist Confidential, a psychotherapy.net podcast. And now, here's your host, Travis Heath.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Therapist Confidential podcast. Today, I get to speak with Dr. Marlene Williams, who is coming from Texas, actually Texas Women's University, as we speak today. And we have some topics that we haven't covered yet on the podcast. I'm really excited to do it, actually. Intergenerational trauma. I think this is something that deserves more airtime than it gets in our field. And maybe we'll make it into peripartum mental health, neurodivergence. I don't know. We'll see where it takes us. But whatever the case, I'm thrilled to have Dr. Marlene Williams on the podcast. Welcome. Would you mind introducing yourself to the people?
Sure. Yes. Thank you so much for having me on today's episode, Travis. I'm so excited to talk with you about this. My name is Marlene Williams. I am originally from Texas, though I have hopped around during my training, but I'm ultimately back here. I wear many hats. So I am, like you said, I'm currently talking to you from campus at Texas Women's University, where I'm on faculty here. It's so fulfilling. I help to train the new, future psychologists that are coming out, and it's an amazing experience. So I do that. I do lots of research. I'm a supervisor. I have my private practice where I do work predominantly with BIPOC and LGBTQ AI or IA folks. I also am a mommy, and that takes up a lot of the other, it's not free time, but extra time when I'm not doing all of this stuff as well. So it's a lot. I jump through a lot of different hats throughout the day, but it is also fulfilling that it propels me forward. So that's a little bit, about me.
No, I appreciate that. I have two little ones myself, 13 and 9, and well, not so little anymore. If the 13-year-old heard me
Yeah,
calling her little, she would not be pleased with that. But yeah, oh boy, I can relate to wearing a lot of different hats for sure. Okay, intergenerational trauma, easy for me to say. This is something that has come to interest me over the last, I don't know, 5 to 7 years. And I think it's come to interest me because I've been interested in like ancestral wisdom and ancestral ways of healing, right? And maybe another way we might think about intergenerational trauma is ancestral trauma, right? But I'll let you define it here in a minute. But I just think that it's a topic that has been under discussed in our field. I mean, trauma is everywhere. Trauma. I hear trauma all the time. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's just like compared to 15, 20 years ago, it's definitely in the center. But intergenerational trauma, I don't hear about as much. Can we start just by defining, or for you, defining how you make sense of that term?
absolutely. Yeah, and that's a good point, right? Like we are talking a lot more about trauma in general. What I have seen is really helpful, though, to add to that is to look at like the greater story and the history and the her story about
Mm.
how trauma has been transmitted across generations in one's family. That often the trauma that we might be experiencing right now didn't just start right now. There's, of course, the historical and socio-political events across time that have contributed to that, and the long-term impacts, though, that it's had on actual people and humans within families and how we parent, how we, learn about how we attach, our attachment styles within our families, how we connect, how we disconnect, right? So it's all these ways that's transmitted, not only that through relationships and history, but also we're learning more about genetically how it is transmitted as well. That like our mothers were carrying this trauma in their wombs and they're in us. And so there's a lot of this that, yeah, it goes felt and experienced, but not necessarily spoken to as directly.
Yes. Oh boy, so many different directions I could go with that. I'll start at sort of, I hope, what is a simple place. You were talking about sort of how this gets passed down, how it gets transmitted. And I'm wondering if you can talk more about that. I mean, so maybe one way is through stories, familial stories, or even cultural stories that get told, but you were also talking about like what gets referred to as epigenetics sometimes. So I'm wondering if you can talk a bit more about like this transmission of intergenerational trauma.
Sure. Yeah. So, and there's a good source on this as well, by Dr. Monakim, for blanking on his first name, but he came out with this book some years ago, My Grandmother's Hands. And yeah, so you're familiar. I teach from this book I teach our trauma class right now to our trainees. And we talk about, like, he has a chapter in there that kind of outlines the different ways that we've learned through years of research of how trauma can be transmitted even at the genetic level, right? And so he talks about literally how, we know also through research that trauma is like held and stored in our bodies, right? And it has long-term impacts there. And that at the same time, each female or woman, when they're born with all of their eggs. And so think about that girl's carrying them, the mother of that girl is, and so on. And so literally, whatever, and this is not a 100%, so I don't want it to sound like that, but um, that is one way that it's transmitted. It's being held in the body. There are ways that we are having certain kinds of stress responses, or reactions to different kinds of trauma or experiences that we're having that also can exacerbate that as well.
Mhm.
And again, that's what I'm kind of speaking to, of like some of this is felt but not necessarily spoken, or we're not always able to pinpoint exactly what it is. But yeah, so the research certainly points to a lot of evidence that it's also passed genetically.
And I'm imagining most people who come and see you in your office, for example, they're probably not familiar with this term intergenerational trauma. So they don't come to you and say, well, these days, with TikTok and everything else, people will come in and say, I have ADHD or I'm a narcissist or I'm this and that, right? Like everybody is labeling themselves these days in ways that didn't exist, at least for me. I've been doing this about 20 years. Early on, I mean, a lot of these labels, people weren't familiar with them. Now they are more familiar. But I think intergenerational trauma is one of those things that maybe not as many people are familiar with quite yet. So, how does it show up when people are in your office?
Yes, that's such a great question. So, oh my gosh, it shows up in so many ways. That's the thing. A lot of the time, it shows up as things like depression, anxiety, and
Mhm.
also just folks' long-term impacts of like repeated exposures to different kinds of family-related traumas, like
Mhm.
absent parents, or gosh, I've even seen this often, like someone having generations, for example, of mothers who didn't really have the resources to be mothers at that time, or the same for fathers. And so there's a lot of that like reparenting process that a lot of people are having to go through. And that's what I meant earlier by, when I'm able to kind of introduce this idea for context with clients, it helps to kind of understand, again, beyond just the present, what all has happened to contribute to this, maybe depression or anxiety that you might be feeling right now. That actually these are patterns, right, of these difficult relationship patterns, for example, that have been happening for literal generations.
Yeah, and it makes me wonder about how, like, words like depression are tough for me, anyways, sometimes. Not that I'm denying that that experience exists for people, I'm not, but just the way that the label gets used, right? Because it can mean so many different things. And it starts to make me wonder how often folks might come to see someone like us and they get a label like depression or anxiety slapped on them. And then this intergenerational trauma isn't really tended to. Do you know what I mean? They get like skills or whatever just to deal with the quote unquote depression, but
Yes.
this sort of deeper intergenerational trauma isn't really dealt with or named.
Oh my gosh, yes, that is so true. That's the other part side of this, right? So I think it's helpful, like you're saying, beyond just treating depression or anxiety, etc. We're also there's the storytelling, the narrative, experience of one's historical or family related trauma that they get to kind of um, have some increased kind of critical consciousness or awareness about in a whole different way,
Mm,
but that they get to tell it from their standpoint. Because often, like you said earlier, it's either not talked about at all within their family, um, or it's talked about from other people's perspectives of what that person should do or shouldn't do. And so I have seen that it's really freeing and actually very empowering, again, beyond just like medications or getting skills to mitigate depression and anxiety, for someone to actually like kind of confront this part of their experience and hone in on what their experience has been. And so part of, along with that, my current obsession really has been
mm,
this whole idea of like post-traumatic growth and resilience and like
mm.
but taking it further with intergenerational trauma and really asking, but what does that actually look like? Like what's the actual process for people who are then breaking the generational cycles, so to speak?
Oh boy. Okay. Yep. Now you're getting into some really interesting stuff for me. One thing that I always try to do with folks on here is try and understand, especially when they're talking about like a particular approach to therapy or working with people, is try and understand what that actually looks like. Now, granted, it can look a little different for different people under different circumstances. But I'm wondering if you can kind of take us inside and of course without, violating confidentiality or anything like that, but just if you could think of patterns that you see or even a specific story of someone showing up and then, and you're able to go, oh, okay, I can see this pattern of intergenerational trauma. And then what do you actually do to work with it?
Yes. Okay. Let's see if I can streamline this a bit. So and yes, talking very generally, the general process again is like, okay, so I work with a lot of Black women.
Yeah.
Um, and so predominantly they may come in with describing symptoms of depression or anxiety. And typically it's in these like, predominantly white spaces or at work,
Mm,
wherever, where there's just
mm,
extra layers of expectations
mhm,
on them. And we, of course, address that part, right? And we kind of dig a bit deeper to see, okay, where has this also, where have some of the ways that they might be like talking to themselves or responding to themselves in these difficult situations? We wonder, okay, where's that coming from? Where'd you learn that kind of, language or response pattern? And often that's when we get a bit deeper into, okay, what was it like within your family? Um, and we get to a really, I think, again, powerful space of like them being able again to tell their actual story from their standpoint, right? So for many people, again who've experienced different forms of complex trauma or intergenerational trauma, they've had to like grow up from a very young age or deal with a lot of just heavy life stuff from a very young age, right?
mm,
And so their experience was never centered. They weren't supported in how they were impacted by having to raise younger siblings, for example, or having parents who were just not able to actually provide those basic level of supports for them. And so the first phase is really like cultivating together this space where they can tell the story from their perspective. And I am very careful about I let them know very directly, like this is what we're doing. We're honing in on your part. How did that feel to you? What did you need at that time?
mm,
And we translate it over to, okay, how does any of that now then apply to what you're currently experiencing and how we can help mitigate against that? Um, and I like it's such a powerful experience because I'm sitting there with them as they're telling their story or just their experiences, and I'm carefully paying attention to when they might shift back over to but my mom feels like this, or my dad does this, and we hold space for that, absolutely. But we also intentionally bring it back to them. But what were you feeling or needing, etc., in that moment? And from there, I do a very, very I think timing is everything, but also delicate balance here with lots of like gentleness and compassion to um, I think just gradually kind of open up, so to speak, this idea of like, okay, well then what happens now? What do you envision for yourself now and moving forward, so to speak? And I do it very gently because I don't want to, of course, communicate that we're disregarding all that has happened, but that the focus really in that kind of phase of therapy is like empowering to for them to have some sense of like autonomy on how they want to handle this, knowing now, having more awareness of the trauma that's happened within their families across generations. Because often the issue becomes, do I want to go back and talk about this with my parents? Like they're not going to listen to me. They don't even have the awareness I have. They're not open to that. And so if we get in this really interesting space of like, well, what feels most in alignment, right, with what you um, have capacity for, what you think would be most effective for your own advancement, liberation from, right, what you might be storing in your body as well. uh, I say it like that because it's open, right? It's not always go talk to your parents and everybody's going to be healed. That just is not the case. Like I think sometimes we have an idea of like, oh, be brave and be resilient, but that actually sometimes, well, not sometimes, like being that one person in your family who has a lot more awareness than everybody else about the trauma that's happened is a really sometimes scary and lonely place to be in, because often everybody else in your family is like, why are you over there? Like, why are you trying to do things so differently? Like, come on. But there's a difference in that level of awareness. And so I see it as part of my amazing just opportunity in my role to kind of sit with people in that difficult space.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting things that you're saying. So one thing that I'm hearing you say is telling their story, telling the story in their words.
Yeah.
And as someone who's interested in narrative therapy, obviously stories are really interesting to me. And the way they function are interesting to me because I found, and I wonder if you found this too, and what you do about it when you do, is that sometimes it's hard for people to find their stories. And sometimes it's actually they've internalized other stories, but they really believe those stories are theirs, you know? Is that making sense? I'm wondering how you
Yeah,
navigate that with folks.
absolutely. Especially so we think about it again through the trauma lens and what we know about how trauma impacts the brain. It literally can shut down or lessen the functioning of the Broca's area, which is involved with language. And it intensifies how we've encoded the memories and some of the strong emotions tied to traumas we've experienced. So that coupled with the really strong internalization, like you said, of other people's narratives within that
Mhm.
story can make for like a really a difficulty with, like you're saying, identifying like what was my experience, how
Mhm.
was that for me. And this is where my feminist therapeutic approaches really shine, okay, because it's all about like we do lots of practice on how we can do some centering and grounding on that internal voice inside of you that is,
Mhm.
you're not always super aware of it, but she, they, he are in there telling you things. There's the reminders of like those sensations in somebody's body of what they're feeling if they can't access the words, right? Um, Connecting more sometimes with emotion if that's what somebody can access, And we do lots of practice sometimes through some mindfulness exercises for that, but also just more of like the prompting and sitting with that together and identifying again like those ways to kind of lessen more that focus on what everybody else was needing at that time, so that they can really hone in on like we're saying, yeah, their own internal experience.
Yeah. And the language that I sometimes hear people use, and people in our field use it too, but I think it's become really popularized now, is like breaking the cycle. This idea of breaking the cycle, especially familial cycles, or at least what appear often to be familial cycles. There could be other influences. But is that part of what you're talking about here? Is it like quote unquote breaking the cycle?
Yes, and I'm glad you bring that up because that's part of, like I said, my current like hyperfixation is like, what does that even mean? You know, and
Yes.
sometimes, and I've noticed some people will say instead of cycles, they say curses, and I often sometimes I will like ask clients like, what do you mean by that? What's a curse? Who
Yeah.
cursed you? You know,
Yeah.
or is it a cycle of patterns over time? But that might be a whole nother thing. But to break a cycle, you know,
Mm.
just even listen to those words. Like to me, that sounds, gosh, like you're breaking it. So in a cycle that's been established, it's something that's been established and been a pattern, oftentimes pervasive. It can feel kind of scary to even think about like what that would be like.
Yeah, for sure. And I love that you're being thoughtful about the language because, and I'll say up front, I'm as guilty of this as anyone else. So I'm not like saying all those people out there do this. I do it too, where in fact, there was some word, I don't remember what the heck it was, in the last 24 hours where, oh, the word was confidence. The word confidence came up, and I
Yeah.
was talking about confidence so confidently. And then I was like, I'm not even exactly sure what that means. Like, what is confidence? How do people get confident? And it sounds so simple, but I feel like a lot of times we regurgitate words or phrases, and especially in our field, they become like pop psychology and people just say them over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And that breaking the cycle has become one of those. Like people will come to me and say, "Oh, I want to break the cycle of this," which that sometimes can be useful, but I like the way that you don't take the language for granted and then you ask them like what do you, whether it's a curse or a cycle or whatever, when you're talking about that and you're using that language, what do you actually mean?
Absolutely. Same thing for resilience. That's the one that I've been like, I'm critiquing it so much because, especially in the research I do, we're looking for scales to help measure this phenomenon, and I don't see it yet. When you look at the current resilience scales, this might be a hot take, but when I'm looking at the items, I'm like, I don't know. When I apply this to intergenerational trauma healing, it's not just like, oh, I move on easily from difficult things. That's literally, or maybe not in those exact words, but that's what some of the items are. I'm like, I don't know if it's just moving on or like not being easily impacted. It's
Mhm.
it's like it's deeper than that. And that's what I'm trying to kind of identify, what is that experience?
That's interesting. And maybe we'll have to create new words or new ways of understanding that. Yeah, resilience is another one that's everywhere, and everyone talks about resilience. And certainly there are experiences, behaviors, etc., that match that term resilience. Like I understand the spirit of that word, but I also worry about how used it is. It almost feels overused. And then it's almost like people are shamed or something if they don't have the proper level of resilience. And I'm thinking like, that seems dangerous in its own right. And then some people that appear to have a lot of resilience, maybe it's not resilience at all, maybe it's avoidance or something else, but it looks like like there's just all sorts of different ways that can shape up. And I'm appreciating the way that you're interrogating and challenging the language, and perhaps maybe like the way you're talking about it, it's like this is still very much in process. You're going. I'm wondering about this. I'm interested in this. You're almost saying like I'm fanatical about finding this out, which is really cool because I think sometimes people assume that we have all the answers. We've read all the books and we have all the answers. And even if we had read all the books, which we can't, although with AI, maybe we can these days, I don't know. But, even if we could do that, we still wouldn't have all the answers for all the people that seek our services. So I'm really interested by this, like, you're
Yeah,
still in process and you're really interested in trying to find out more.
absolutely. Constantly. Like, and I think that especially in the clinical sense or like when I'm with clients, I think that like constantly having that level of openness, kind of creativity to like just wonder. Like I'm always wondering what more and what exactly is the experience for this person because it's just not the same for every person. So I try to be really careful about that part, not assuming what these words mean when people throw them out there, asking, and we kind of define it together from their perspective.
Hmm. I want to shift gears a little bit in thinking. So we've been talking a lot of like familial sort of stories. And of course, familial stories are connected to other more dominant cultural stories and things, of course. But I wonder if we can focus on some of those stories. You said you work with a lot of Black women, for example, and I'm wondering about things like racism, colonialism, etc. The sort of systems that continue to perpetuate these dynamics. And I'm wondering about that sort of trauma, not just the familial trauma, but what we might call like broader cultural traumas, and like some of the like almost systemic moral injury that comes from that.
Yeah, yeah, that comes up again a lot. It initially, right? Like it comes up as again how they're having to coexist and navigate in certain spaces. And often, right, there are certain parts of their identities that they're not able to fully express, unfortunately, in different environments that they are in. Particularly, a lot of it is like at work or maybe at school where they're experiencing a lot of intersections of like of racism, sexism, classism. Um, and so for that, it's an interesting process. Again, like we do pull in some of the historical elements of that.
Hmm.
Um, and at times, we are, depending on, their family history and connection to ancestors, we're able to kind of like pull on some ancestral wisdom or maybe just older generations, past generations within their family as like how they just identifying ways they might navigate those different spaces as well. Um, and kind of trying to get to a place of some kind of empowerment, again, where they might be able to identify ways that they can coexist in these institutions and environments from a stance of like we talked about, right? Those internalized messages that happens a lot here too. Things like I don't really belong here, like they don't really, want me here, and I've done just beautiful work even with myself. Okay, so I'm not just talking about other people, but like really sitting with and reflecting on, wait a minute, like, hold on. Actually, and I'm gonna use your word here, confident, but actually, they need me here. Like they need me here. I don't. I bring things to this institution or where I am as a Black woman that is really special. And I bring with me um, the energy and wisdom from my own ancestors. Like they're part of the reason why I am here where I am. I don't know if that's all that what you asked me, but that's what's coming to my mind right now.
No, no, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
This is a question that maybe is a little more just for me because I'm curious about it, but
Cool.
ancestral wisdom, you mentioned that phrase. That's something that I think about often. And has come more and more into my work. On one hand, like I can definitely see the value of psychology, psychiatry, et cetera, over the last century or so. And like, I mean, it offers pathways to healing potentially.
Mhm.
Those have historically been more Eurocentric pathways, and I mean, I could critique those, but it offers something that's been important. Also, sometimes there's a little arrogance in that where we act like healing's only taken place in the last century or so. I mean, people have been healing as long as there have been people, you know what I mean? And so one thing that I've noticed is that ancestral wisdom can
Mhm.
sometimes be really, really useful in ways that psychiatric and psychological wisdom is not, or is not landing the same way. So I'm wondering if you could speak some to this idea of ancestral wisdom, maybe some interesting ways you've seen it show up in your work, how you channel it, etc.
Absolutely. Yeah, I appreciate all that you're saying there. I feel similarly, and I think that it helps to kind of um, humble us a bit in in my role, especially as a therapist. That like I'm not the only source of helping for people. There are so many other ways, and yeah, so sometimes again, depending on somebody's like level of connection with their family and ability to get more history or stories, about ancestors or just past generations, that can be really powerful. Like sometimes clients are able to have these really powerful conversations with their family members and get more of that like raw, real connection to past generations and what they'd experienced and how they survived and all of that. Another way often that we'll talk about is like finding it in other sources. Sometimes I'll have clients kind of read books and that are connected in some way to their own identities that might um, provide some more context for some of the experiences of their ancestors or past generations as well. And then there's just really, I think, some of the practices of us kind of talking through together what that again means to them, their current level or a level of connection or disconnection, so to speak, with that history or ancestors' experience and what that means to them. And if there's any, function that meaning might serve, can that be applied to, your present experience? Is there any part of that that you want to take on and sometimes it's like parts you don't want to, and that's okay too.
Okay, so I think there's this interesting balance sometimes that happens when doing this kind of work where it's like, how do we honor the past and also not let the past dictate the present and the future, right? So, where do you find the balance in honoring the past, but perhaps like not being defined by the past?
That is a beautiful question, and it takes me back to something that Monicum says in his book. He talks about how there are certain parts of the past that become identified as culture. Like we start calling certain things culture. Yeah, that's just part of how we live. Yeah. And so if that's one way is kind of when necessary, I suppose, challenging like, is it culture? Meaning how might some of these events in the past be serving you or not necessarily serving you? Um, on the other end, I also think about this in terms of, uh, yeah, this is another kind of, I guess, critique-ish of some of the resilience stuff is like, um, if we're kind of defining someone's present and their own healing solely based off of this idea of needing to be resilient and to overcome all that has happened.
Mhm.
Um, like you're saying, we I think there might be some crucial points of the present that we might be missing. And again, for me at least, in some of the work that I do, that's where again, even in the exploration of what resilience and growth and all of those things mean, we're careful to not have it be defined by someone else or some other past event, but it's like, but what is the meaning that you're making from this for yourself?
That's a theme that I keep hearing there, that it seems like maybe an important thread in your work is what is the meaning of that you're
Yeah,
making of this for yourself?
yeah, it's everything. Yeah.
And I suppose that that's useful for anyone, and I think it can be especially useful for people whose voices, for whatever the reasons are, maybe they're societal reasons, maybe they're familial reasons, maybe other reasons, but for whatever the reason, they don't tend to have a voice, right? Or their voice has been silenced, and so this seems like an important thread where people telling their own stories in their own words.
It's such a big thread. And as you were saying that, I'm reminded, I'm like, where did I get that from? Why is that a focus of mine? And honestly, it comes from a lot of the research that I've done. Like I've done a lot of, I started out with a heavier focus on identity development. And if you
Mhm.
go back, like Dr. William Cross with Nigressen's theory, and he's developed these identity models for Black racial identity, and then a lot of other identity models, not just on race, have modeled after that, and they all have a similar process they've identified through years of research, that you basically start out at like this place of not knowing much, sometimes denial of your experiences, and then you go through these difficult experiences that make you aware. You start to question it, you start to get angry, and then somewhere along the way towards the latter part of this development, you start to like redefine for yourself what does my Blackness mean to me, and you
Mhm.
get to kind of integrate the parts that serve you or that have a function for you, that are in alignment for you, and also the parts that do not, the parts that are labeled quote unquote culture, but no, they don't work for you, for example.
Mhm.
I think that's where a lot of that comes from. That, of course, with the a lot of the feminist therapeutic practices.
It's a lovely question to ask people, what does your Blackness mean to you? How do you make sense of Blackness? In a world that spends most of its time making sense of whiteness, by the way. Um,
Right,
you
right.
know, I mean, so in a way there, yes, you're turning the tables back to their own storing, but also you're kind of turning the cultural tables there where you're centering Blackness in the conversation.
Right. And to your point, so like to pull it full circle with what you were asking about a moment ago,
Hmm.
what would it be like for a Black person to be able to define their Blackness in a way that is not based off of how whiteness has been defined in opposition to that, right?
Hmm.
What does it mean to you, um, from your own experience or from things that you have learned about yourself, your identity, your people, your community?
Hmm. Yeah, I'm wondering about this kind of tension. It exists for me a lot in the work I do. I imagine it does for you, and just listening to you talk the last little bit. The kind of tension between quote unquote internal work and then system sort of work,
Yeah.
social work, not the field of social
Mhm.
work, but doing
Yeah. Mhm.
social work, right?
Mhm.
And I think historically our field has focused so much on individual personality and psychopathology, and everything almost feels hyper individualist. And on the other hand, some of these things we're talking about today are very systems based. And of
Yeah.
course, we're not going to be able to change entire systems in the work that we do. And that's the critique that often comes, is like, well, how are you going to deal with racism in therapy? I mean, you can empathize with it, I guess, but how are you can't change systemic racism. And of course, I think that's ridiculous. Not that you can change systemic racism in therapy, but that it cannot be addressed in meaningful ways. So I guess I'm wondering too about that tension between like the kind of classical individualist psychology and psychiatry, and then more systems-based understanding of things and how this comes together for you in your work?
Yeah, I love this question because we talk about it a lot in supervision or just with trainees in general, because I think that that is a crucial part of our training to at least reflect on, like what we have like our students kind of think through, not only as a a budding therapist and researcher, and some of them are teaching, but also like where do you stand maybe on advocacy? What are you passionate about and what do you see your role in that area being? And we do talk about like, there are levels to that where you might be out literally, working with local government and changing policies, but or maybe working with local community organizations, but also like you're saying, what could it look like in therapy with your clients? And we've gotten to some really beautiful conversations about that, right? Like there's, I think, so many different ways. And yes, like you said, we're not necessarily like gonna transform the whole system that way,
Yeah.
but just like with many other kinds of ideologies, internalized messages, things like that, that may be serving some kind of maladaptive function, we'll say, in folks' lives. Same thing for any of the isms. Like those are free game. We can process through those in therapy together in ways that are empathetic, compassionate, curious, and our or my thinking is that in one way that can be a corrective emotional experience, so to speak, of somebody thinking about whatever this ism or system of oppression a bit differently. um, who's to say what they do with with that information or whatever, but at the very least it gets them thinking about it. We also talk about how even the organizations or institutions that we meet with our clients those are institutions, those are systems that often sometimes there's forms of oppression, just inequalities happening, and so there's even roles or ways we can help um, improve those systems, so to speak, that would then help further serve our clients. Like sometimes it looks like advocating for reduced fees or advocating for an extended length of session amount, because often on college campuses they like cut it off because everybody's like burnt out and long wait lists. But sometimes we're having to also advocate for certain, especially some marginalized groups that just really would not have access to these kinds of resources outside of their wherever they're getting services at.
Yep. I'm wondering, as you progress through this kind of work with people, what are the kind of indicators or signposts that tell you that maybe some shifts are starting to occur? Because I feel like one of the challenges existing in such a binary society as we do, where it's like you're either healed or you're not. It's like, I don't know. I mean, I think I don't know, are we ever healed maybe, but it feels more like we're on a journey of healing. It's a process-based thing. And so rather than just, asking the question of like, how do you know that therapy's been successful? It's more like, what are some of the signposts or indicators that you start to see that let you know some shifts are starting to occur?
Oh, I love that question. I want to deeply reflect on it. The first thing, I know there's actually there are many, but the first thing that is coming to my mind, that I guess maybe is first coming to my mind because it's felt really impactful, is yeah, a lot of the work that I've done, I do with excuse me, with moms, moms who have experienced a lot of trauma in their families or intergenerational trauma. Some of them come from immigrant families, and now they're in this position in life to create life and grow life, and sometimes struggling because it's like I didn't have this. There's literally no blueprint, but also like my parents didn't know how to do this for me. and it's that's caused a lot of inner turmoil and lots of long-term impacts. And where I see shifts are those moments where they start to make some of those connections between what they've experienced and how it's impacting them right now, and then they're able to, in the moment, because we also, within all of this, I didn't even mention, I don't think, the emotion regulation stuff we're doing as they're sharing their stories and applying it to the present, is when then they're able to stop and kind of pause in those difficult moments, and recognize, I know what this is. Like I know what this feeling is that's happening to me right now. I know where it's coming from. And it
Mm,
hurts, but also I have this empowerment that, like, I wanna I'm doing this different with my daughter. I'm doing this different with my son. I'm doing it different with myself.
mm,
That part is so powerful. And again, on multiple levels, because then this is another generation right now that's learning it, teaching it, modeling it to the younger generation, that hopefully then they have it and pass it. I think that's why it feels so impactful. And again, though I'm working with one-on-one, it's impacting hopefully other generations of people, not just the one person I'm talking to.
You've mentioned working with moms a few times. I mean, we could do a whole podcast on this subject, but I want to dive in just a little bit to that work that you do. I mean, peripartum, motherhood. I mean, these are things that interest you in your work. You mentioned being a mom yourself, so you have lived experience there too. But I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that work that you do with peripartum and mothers.
Yes. Um, it's work that is so near and dear to my heart. And for all the reasons you described. But yeah, I work again with a lot of moms who, again, who are healing from their own intergenerational trauma and just complex traumas, while being in that unique position of then parenting of their children. And there's a certain level of, like, of fear that comes with that, hypervigilance that comes with that. um, Sometimes it's the literal uh, process of getting the child here that can be traumatic as well. So we sometimes are literally working through that process. And then, of course, they get here and we're working through, like, okay, what's it like now in motherhood? Here's the thing. The big part, now it's coming to me, is that most young girls are socialized to, like, um not listen to those internal cues or voices or whatever inside that tell them, oh, I don't like this, or like this is not okay, or I'm angry, right? We're told to kind of ignore that. That gets amplified in motherhood because it's already internalized. But then, when, as moms, there are so many expectations. You got to do it this way. You got to do it that way. And then your older generations in your family have strong opinions. It's the biggest, I think, one of the biggest transitions somebody can ever go in their life. And then you've, on top of that, got people from all sides telling you how to do it and what you should do. And so there's just so many levels there to work through and to process. And again, it's a similar process that is my thread, I suppose, like you pointed out, is like centering. Okay, what about for you? Like, what are you envisioning for motherhood? How can we center on what feels in alignment for you? Because there's just so much coming from all sides.
Ooh, boy. Yeah. I mean, obviously, as a man, I'm not a mom. I haven't experienced being a mom. I've worked with moms before, and it almost seems like an impossible spot to be in. where it's like a forest of double binds where it just feels like you can't win. And then, there's in thinking about like uh, peripartum, for example, and then, we hear things like the baby blues and which, very real, but oftentimes like the way that the medical system and even the psychiatric and psychological systems function would seem to me, again, as someone who's not a woman, seem to be very minimizing of those experiences, and I feels like the treatment's often really lacking, and it's just like it's wild to me, even if you just think about things in pregnancy, like when people say morning sickness,
Mm.
like I can't tell you how many women have been like, morning sick, like this is morning,
Okay.
afternoon, night sickness. And then it made me wonder, like, did
Yeah.
some probably white male physician, like, his wife was pregnant or something, and he was hoping when he came home from work, she'd no longer be sick or something, make this term, because it's like such an inaccurate term. And I guess the point I'm trying to make is, yes, everything you say, everyone has an opinion about it. And it feels like, there's a double bind all the time and you can't satisfy everyone. But then the systems that are supposed to be supporting often feel like, I don't know, they feel like decades behind in how they're making sense of this. And it just, I can't tell you how many women I've talked to who are just completely befuddled. Like they're
Yeah.
looking at me like, does anyone understand what the hell is going on with me, kind of thing, And then even among women, sometimes it's like hard to share the reality of it because you're supposed to be happy all the time and you're supposed to be glowing while you're pregnant, and then you're supposed to be glowing when you have a baby, and all of these things. And so there's these real dominant stories, which of course come from patriarchy and other
Yeah.
sources. But sorry, it's long-winded, but I'm just trying to say that I feel like we're so far behind
Yeah.
supporting women, women's health, women's mental health during pregnancy and motherhood.
I so agree. And this is why, like, any, new mom around me, like, and on, um, just in conversations with other folks, compassionately or gently am kind of recommending, like, don't my hope is that moms can have a support team that's not just their medical doctors, like seek out doulas, midwives, a
Hmm.
therapist,
Hmm.
other kinds of healers, if you're needing it, because it just provides a much more comprehensive support team. I can share vulnerably that, like, with my son, I had a very traumatic birth experience. But I did have midwives and I had a doula and all of that, but still just, had couldn't avoid the hospital system, ended up there. And I'm just so happy that I had them though as well, because even the questions, the more medical questions they were asking me shortly after his birth, like, they didn't capture half of what I was feeling. There were no questions about what I was feeling. It was just like, "Are you feeling blue?" And I'm like, "Well, I guess." But blue doesn't even describe, okay?
Mm-hmm.
The feeling, the depths of that kind of emotion where I'm connecting with my this new life, and it's so beautiful, but also really sad about the whole process of getting him here and like processing that trauma on my own. So at that time I didn't feel like I could, like, really kind of depend on the more medical supportive team. I was leaning on people like my therapist and my doula and my midwives for some of that other support, more comprehensive support.
It's interesting if you look at the data around women and then you go further, Black women in the United States and healthcare, and when you look at, I mean, I think we're like 30th or something when it comes to uh, what is it, mortality rates or something for babies worldwide or something like this. You can look at some of the public health data and it's just
Mhm.
shocking. I mean, it's not really, but you would think in a country like United States, the way the country gets storied and everything, where we have all of this money, that we would have top flight, not only medical care for women who are pregnant and then after pregnancy, but also, like we would have good mental health care throughout the process. And, reading things like, I remember when I became a father for the first time, I was reading things about like, oh, for women after they give birth, it could take up to 2 years for hormones to reset. And I'm like, well, no one said this. Like when we went to the appointments and stuff, none of the doctors said any of this stuff. So the information is there, but I just remember getting some of this and I was just shocked that and it was almost like, isn't like, shouldn't someone be doing something about all of this? And it was like, no. And the same, like you just said, we do this a lot with colloquial language, I guess, but baby blues. I mean, that makes it sound the baby blues like, oh, it's a little and it's like, gosh, no, this can feel like an existential crisis to people, and we're calling it the baby blues. So anyway, I mean, it just feels like we're so far behind the curve. And that leads me to the question of, especially for people in our field, for therapists who are listening to this, I mean, and maybe they don't even specialize in peripartum work, but still, this comes up. You work with women, you work with mom. I mean, this will come up. And a lot of times women don't even know to seek out specialization in this because it's not around. It's not like you can just go to your insurance panel and find a bunch of people who specialize in peripartum mental health. I wish you could, but that's not the reality for most people. So for more generalist therapists who are listening to this, who are working with women who are pregnant or moms, I mean, is there anything any bit of advice or starting point you'd give them for doing better work?
Oh, love this question because I have this conversation sometimes with some of my students, my trainees. Um, Even right now, I'm thinking about, yeah, one of my students who is a man, and he, was similarly like he was working with some clients who were moms, um, and he was just having this like, I don't know, like where do I start? What do I do? And the first thing I told him was like, you need to maybe get a bit more in touch or connected as much as you can with like what this experience is. Like you need to read about this. You need to look at what's it called? What's the site? Postpartum International.
Mm.
Postpartum Support International, am I saying that right? PSI has so many resources for folks who want to get trainings in this area or just more awareness. And they even have all these different support groups if clients are needing that based on unique experiences of moms. But I basically was making this point of like, your client is talking about this traumatic birth experience or this existential crisis, so to speak, of entering motherhood. Get a glimpse, so to speak, of like what is that, what does that entail, and of course cue into what her individual experience has been. But I think maybe my message is like, if any part of you feels kind of far apart from that experience, or like seek out ways to get a more in-depth connection with it, just like we do with other kinds of presenting concerns that our clients bring in. And I say that just because again, there are so many assumptions about the motherhood experience, and often stigmatizing or kind of downplaying certain aspects of the motherhood experience, that if we're more deeply connecting to it, that maybe we'll catch those, be more likely to catch them.
Want to be mindful of time here. I've really enjoyed the conversation. If people are interested, and you were mentioning some research that you've done, as us academics are required to do along the route, right? But you've mentioned some of the research you've done, some of the clinical work you're involved in, et cetera. If people are wanting to know the work that you're doing better, are there any resources where they can connect with you?
Sure. Let's see. You can find me on my website, therapyforfreedom.com. That's more of my clinical side of things. I don't really put my research on there, but I'm trying to see how people can find my research. But if you're curious about what I've got going on at TWU, you can find me there. On the faculty page there. It'll give you a bit more information. But other than that, you can probably contact me more easily through Therapy for Freedom or just see what I've got going on.
I got to ask you about that title, Therapy for Freedom. Tell me about the genesis of that.
Oh yeah. Well, it's tied into all the things we've talked about today of like um hopefully the process of freeing oneself from whatever it is that might be contributing to whatever kind of distress or discomfort or difficulties you're having now. And it's kind of a maybe double entendre because I work a lot with BIPOC LGBTQ folks, like literal freedom and liberation again from like these systems of oppression. So that's kind of where my brain was when I came up with that.
Yeah, it's a really beautiful name for a practice. Dr. Marlene Williams, I really appreciate your time. Hopefully we can talk again in the near future if you'd be up for it.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for having me.